Today's video is sponsored by Shudder, the ultimate streaming service for fans of horror. Sign up for Shudder for only $5.99 a month and get ad-free unlimited access to the largest collection of acclaimed horror movies, thrillers, and original series streamed right on your favorite devices. With new spine-tingling content added weekly, you won't want to miss out on this. I was actually very excited when Shudder reached out to me, because I started using their service back in 2019, when I saw that they were hosting the new Creepshow series, and ever since I've been hooked. As a fan of the old Creepshow movies from the 1980s, this new show not only did a fantastic job with recapturing what made those films so great, but also made up for that disastrous Creepshow 3 film. So let's all give Shudder a hand for helping us move past that absolute dog shit movie and making Creepshow great again. Yay. This is definitely my personal recommendation if you're interested in checking out this service. They also recently did a Creepshow animated special, which I thought was pretty cool as well. But if you're still on the fence, you can go to shudder.com, that's SHUDDER.com, and use the promo code UNIT522. And if you do that, you can try Shudder for 30 days absolutely free. It's time to start celebrating Halloween 24/7 by streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content on Shudder. Who doesn't love a good ghost story? Especially around the holidays. I've reviewed countless accounts of the paranormal and supernatural in online articles and TV shows. I speak from experience when I say, until it happens to you, you will have a hard time believing any of these stories. I openly admit that some are more plausible than others, and most of the ones you hear about nowadays are just made-up garbage. With that being said, I will ask the listener to please keep an open mind. My goal in submitting my story is not to convince anyone of the existence of the paranormal, but to simply share my experience with the world. Perhaps someone in the audience has gone through something similar and can have some type of reassurance that they're not alone, and that there are some things out there that science cannot always explain. But I must warn you, things are going to get pretty deep. Back in law school, my professor would often say, sometimes it's hard to remain objective in a subjective reality. I couldn't agree more. I come from a very wealthy family. My grandfather was the co-founder of one of the biggest pharmaceutical corporations in Canada. My father followed in his footsteps and eventually became CEO when my grandfather became too old to run the company. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this all played a pretty significant role in me pursuing my law degree. I love my family, but I am not blind to the unfair practices that pharmaceutical corporations get up to, and my family's company is no exception. That's partly why I decided to become a labor attorney. I wanted to protect the little guy from being screwed over by the big corporations. I'd like to think that I make a difference, but I'm not going to lie. The good guys do not always win. This story isn't about that, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm preaching. I just wanted you guys to know a little bit about me. Now let's turn back the clock to the winter of 1985. It was late December, right around Christmas time. Now I mentioned earlier that my grandfather founded his company in Canada. However, my father was born in New England, and that's where me and my sister grew up. Every year, my father and grandfather would go on these extended hunting trips in upstate New York. My grandparents owned an old manor there, and that's where me and my family would spend most of our Christmases. The manor was enormous. It was 3 stories tall, had a fountain out front, and of course, was surrounded on all sides by a thick forest. I can't recall all the history of the manor, but I do know that it was originally built as a hospital in colonial times, and that many people died there because of the lack of understanding when it came to certain illnesses in those times. As you can imagine, this place had its share of ghost stories. But me and my sister didn't really invest much into such things. We were more interested in playing hide-and-go-seek or tag in the long, endless corridors. The mansion had a very large basement. My grandparents would store a lot of antiques and furniture that they had collected over the years. We were never allowed down there because my parents were worried that we would hurt ourselves or end up breaking something extremely valuable. So naturally, being the curious troublemakers we were, whenever my sister and I were left alone in the old house, we would always try and see if the door that led down into the basement was left unlocked. Much to our dismay, it never was. But this did not deter us. In fact, we sort of turned it into a game, and roamed through the old house looking for the magic key that would open the basement door. However, in the winter of 1985, everything would change. My father and grandfather were off on their traditional hunting trip, and my mother and grandmother were doing some Christmas shopping in town. At this time, I was 15, and my sister Natalia was 12. So we were old enough to be on our own for a while. We no longer played our little games around the manor, but we were both still very curious about what was in the basement. So, as soon as we were left alone, we quickly made our way to the basement door. We expected it to be locked, as it had been so many times before, but with a turn of the old metal handle, the door swung open with a creak. I flipped the switch on the wall to my right, and a single light bulb flickered to life above my head, revealing a set of old wooden stairs that led down into the dark basement. I turned back to my sister, and she seemed just as astonished as I was. After so many years, we would finally get to see what was down in the basement. We made our way down the staircase and stumbled around in the darkness. The initial creepiness was replaced by aggravation, as we could not locate another light switch that would illuminate the rest of the basement. Natalia rushed back up the stairs to grab a pair of flashlights from our suitcases. She returned a short time later, and soon our flashlight beams revealed a maze of sheets covering various unknown objects. If I can give you an accurate description of what was in this basement, think of the movie The Others, where Nicole Kidman's character encountered the old blind woman in the junk room. Remember how those white sheets were covering all the furniture? Imagine that on a larger scale. Me and Natalia made our way through the sea of obstacles, occasionally uncovering the ones that looked like they had an interesting shape to them. They were mostly old-fashioned tables, chairs, and shelves, stuff that we were just too young to truly appreciate. When we got to the very back of the basement, there was a corridor that went back for about 30 feet and then suddenly stopped. It was an odd design. It looked like a hallway that was walled off halfway through. There was something mounted to the very end of this corridor that was covered by a white, dirty bed sheet. Curious, we both approached the unknown object. I instantly noticed that there was a light fixture on the ceiling, along with a switch on the wall to my left. I flipped the switch, and the corridor was illuminated. We both turned our attention to the dirty sheet that was ominously covering whatever was on the wall in front of us. There wasn't much discussion between us. It was mutually decided that we were going to find out what was underneath. We both pulled on either side of the sheet to discover an old wall-mounted mirror. Since we were on either side of the mirror when we pulled the sheet off, we didn't see our reflections right away. The mirror had one of those worn-down carved frames, and its glass was badly stained and cracked. It wouldn't have looked out of place in a dumpster. But as we would soon find out, this was no ordinary mirror. Natalia bent down to tie her shoe as I stood in front of the mirror. At first, it was difficult to make out my reflection, but I was startled to discover that an old man was staring back at me. I dropped my flashlight out of fear and fell backward. My sister looked up and saw the frightened look on my face and asked me what was wrong. "I saw an old man in the mirror. I swear to God." She gave me a confused look before quickly standing up and facing the mirror herself. She instantly went still, and then began to visibly tremble. I got to my feet and looked into the mirror. Aside from the horrified look on my sister's face, both of our reflections were normal. However, something was seriously freaking my sister out. I placed my hand on her shoulder and was about to ask her if she was okay. But before I could get a word out, I was cut off by a shriek of terror. My sister screamed so loud, I'm surprised she didn't shatter the old mirror. She took off back into the basement and up the stairs. I looked one last time at my blurry reflection before turning off the light and following my sister back up the stairs. Natalia was inconsolable after that. She spent the rest of that night crying in bed. From that day forward, Natalia wasn't the same person. She became cold and distant, and this lasted for years. As she got older, she became bitter towards everyone, and had these night terrors where she would wake up screaming, always standing in front of her dresser mirror. I knew that whatever she saw in that old mirror in my grandparents' manor was the root cause of all of this. What I saw in its reflection was certainly frightening, but I eventually put it behind me. Whatever she saw must have been much worse, to the point where it mentally scarred her. I tried talking to her about it several times, but she would always shut me down, even threatening to kill me in my sleep on one occasion. I brought up what happened in the basement to my parents, but all they did was scold me for going down there. Natalia's strange behavior didn't go unnoticed by my parents, and it wasn't long before she was attending therapy, and shortly after, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The night terrors became worse, and she even started sleepwalking. She would go to the different mirrors in our house and just stare into them for hours before screaming. From a young age, Natalia had a gift for drawing pictures. Before that day at the manor, she would draw typical pictures of our family holding hands, flowers and birds, etc. But after that day in the basement, she would draw these pictures of a mangled-looking woman who had half of her face missing. Natalia's mental health would continue to deteriorate, and as it did, she was put on a cocktail of different medications. The drugs stopped the screaming, but Natalia became a shell of her former self, reduced to just sitting and staring blankly off into space. This tore my family apart. My parents could never agree on how to go about treating Natalia. My father wanted to commit her to a mental hospital, but my mother was adamantly against that. This caused them to fight a lot, and they would eventually divorce many years later. Shortly after graduating high school, I moved out of my parents' house. My dad rented out an apartment for me while I attended college, and I was grateful for that. As difficult as it is for me to admit, I did not want to be around Natalia anymore, and I no longer wanted to watch my mother try so desperately to get through to her, trying to bring back the sweet girl she once was. Some time passed, and one day I received a phone call from my dad. I could tell by the sound of his voice that he did not have good news. He eventually told me that my sister had wandered away from the house the night before and made her way to a nearby busy highway. This next part is difficult for me to relay, and I will not go into details, but according to the police, several eyewitnesses saw Natalia throw herself in front of a speeding semi-truck. About a week later, as I watched my sister's closed casket being lowered into the ground, I kept thinking about that old mirror in the basement of my grandparents' manor. With my sister's diagnosis and the passing of time, I had forgotten all about that day, and I began to wonder, what did she see in its reflection that day? That question wouldn't be answered until many years later. In 2017, my mother passed away, and me and my wife spent a couple of days gathering all of her belongings from her house before we put it on the market. In my mother's attic, I came across a box marked Natalia. The box contained some of my sister's old clothes and other small things. At the very bottom of the box, I found a large folder. In this folder were some of Natalia's old drawings. I flipped through the pictures. Most of them were drawings of our happy family, holding hands with big smiles on our faces. All except for one. When I got to the very last drawing in the folder, tears began to roll down my face as I held up that last picture. The question that has haunted me for so many years was finally answered. The drawing was of a little girl staring into an old mirror, and the mirror's reflection was a mangled woman with half a face.